The air in Old Man Bellow's study was thick, heavy with the scent of old leather and the ghosts of 1,000 cigars. Chief Adekunle Bello stood stiffly before the mahogany desk, his own reflection staring back from its polished surface, distorted and small. His father was not looking at him. The old man's gaze was fixed on a framed, sepia-toned photograph of his own father, a man with a hard jaw and eyes that seemed to burn through the glass. "The Bello line does not run thin," he said, his voice a low rumble. He never had to raise it. "It is a river, Adekunle, strong, deep. It must not start to run dry with you." A familiar heat climbed the back of Adekunle's neck. Outside the door, he could hear the faint clink of glasses from the lavish dinner he'd just hosted. He could almost feel the smug satisfaction of his cousin, Jide, who was no doubt savoring every moment of this humiliation. "I am aware of my responsibilities, father." The patriarch finally turned, his eyes sweeping over his son's expensive suit, his solid gold watch, the entire performance of success. The look was withering. "Are you? Your wife is a fine woman, from a fine family, but her name cannot produce an heir. And you are 42. He picked up a solid crystal paperweight, turning it over and over in his palm. "Jide has 3 sons. 3. The name hung in the air like a poison. Jide the vulture. Adekunle could see him now, whispering to the board members, planting seeds of doubt about his leadership, his future, about his legacy. "This is a private matter," the younger man said, his voice clipped. "The Bello conglomerate is not a private matter," his father countered, placing the paperweight down with a soft final thud. "It is an empire, and an empire needs a clear line of succession." He waved a dismissive hand. "Leave me. I have things to consider." Adekunle walked out of the study, his posture rigid. He did not rejoin his guests. He went straight to his car, the engine of his Mercedes a low growl in the quiet night. He slid behind the wheel and barked an address at his driver. The man who had been driving him for 5 years flinched slightly and pulled away from the curb. The CEO didn't notice. His mind was already racing, turning over the pieces of a desperate, dangerous plan. The lawyer's office was cold, the air conditioning cranked to an inhuman level. It smelled of clean paper and quiet panic. Adekunle sat opposite Mr. Adisa, a small, meticulous man whose entire career was built on discretion. "I need a solution," he stated, his voice flat. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished table. "And I don't need the ethical debate, Mr. Adisa swallowed, adjusting his glasses. "Chief, a surrogacy arrangement is complex, especially under these circumstances. Find a candidate," Adekunle cut him off. "Healthy, anonymous, someone who understands that this is a transaction, not an adoption, someone with no connections, no family to ask questions." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Someone powerless. Get it done." The search took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of the CEO growing more frantic, straightening every picture frame and penholder in his office until they were perfectly aligned. He snapped at his staff, his temper a thin wire stretched to its breaking point. Zainab watched him from across their cavernous, silent mansion, her expression serene, her eyes missing nothing. Finally, Adisa called. "I have found someone," he said, his voice hushed. "She fits the criteria perfectly." Her name was Imani. She sat on the worn leather chair in the lawyer's office, a space so alien to her it felt like another planet. She wore jeans and a t-shirt that were faded but immaculately clean. Her spine was straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She hadn't said a word for 10 minutes, just listened as the legal counsel explained the terms of the contract. The sheer amount of money made her head spin, but she did not let it show on her face. This was not a lifeline. It was a lifeline to a lifeline. It was the capital she needed to build a foundation under her own feet, to crawl out of the gaping hole that had swallowed her life. Her benefactor watched her from across the table. He saw a girl who looked like she could be blown over by a strong wind. He saw her worn-out shoes. He saw her as the solution. Nothing more. He was satisfied. She was exactly what he'd asked for, invisible. "Mr. Adisa pushed the thick stack of papers toward her. "If you'll just sign at the bottom of each page." The young woman did not move. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the dense text. Her finger, slender and calloused, stopped on a single paragraph in the middle of page 12. "This section is ambiguous," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the sterile air of the room. Both men looked at her, startled. "It says here my medical care is covered, but any unforeseen medical eventualities are my own liability." She finally lifted her gaze from the paper, her dark eyes meeting the lawyer's. "Whose definition of unforeseen, mister?" Adisa was flustered. He cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "That is standard legal language, my dear. A formality." Adekunle felt a flash of irritation. A complication. He did not have time for complications. He opened his mouth to dismiss her concern, to tell the lawyer to handle it. But Imani was already speaking again, her tone still level. "A term is either defined or it is a loophole. Which is it?" There was a moment of stunned silence. The CEO stared at her. This was not the meek, powerless girl he had assessed. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a sharp, calculating intelligence. It was inconvenient, but it also meant she understood exactly what she was signing. There would be no misunderstandings later. He gave a sharp nod to his counsel. "Define it. Redraft the clause. Now." The lawyer, sweating slightly, quickly made a handwritten amendment and initialed it. He pushed the papers back toward her. This time, Imani picked up the pen. She methodically signed each page, her signature a neat, precise script. The last one felt different. It was a clean break. The sealing of a tomb and the laying of a cornerstone. Adekunle stood up, all business. He did not look at her again. He gave a curt nod to Adisa, transferred the initial payment, arranged the accommodations. He turned and walked out of the office without a backward glance. The young woman watched him go. She felt nothing. Emptiness was a shield. She had just sold a year of her life, a piece of her body, but she had bought herself a future. She stood and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun of Adesola City. The noise of the traffic hit her like a physical blow. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. A bank alert. The number had so many zeros she had to read it twice. It was real. The chapter was closed. A new one, terrifying and unknown, had just begun. And in his high-rise office across the city, the powerful man straightened a silver pen on his desk, feeling a surge of triumph. The plan was in motion. The line of succession was secure. He had bent the world to his will, and he hadn't even had to learn the girl's name. The apartment was on the 25th floor of a new anonymous glass tower overlooking the lagoon. It was a gilded cage, furnished with expensive, soulless furniture that looked like it had been chosen from a catalog. A security detail, polite and silent, was stationed in the hallway. Imani was a prisoner of luxury. The first week, she did nothing but sleep and eat the bland, catered food that arrived in sealed containers 3 times a day. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her. She would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows for hours, watching the tiny boats crisscross the water below, feeling utterly disconnected from the world she used to know. This was not living. It was waiting. On the 8th day, she started to fight back in small, secret ways. She struck up a quiet conversation with the younger of the 2 security guards, a man named Bayo. She learned he missed his mother's cooking. One evening, using a sliver of her initial payment, she made a mobile transfer to him. An hour later, he knocked softly on her door and slipped her a warm, foil-wrapped package. The smoky, spicy scent of real street food suya filled the sterile air. It was the first thing that had tasted authentic in weeks. Her greatest act of rebellion was silent and invisible. Late at night, when the city lights glittered below, she would take a burnt matchstick from the gas cooker. Kneeling on the floor of her walk-in closet, she pulled out the bottom drawer of a cheap nightstand. On the rough, unfinished wood of its back, she began to sketch. She drew cantilevered balconies, soaring glass atriums, and innovative public housing complexes. It was a ghost of her old life, a secret map of the future she was determined to reclaim. Meanwhile, in the Bello mansion, an entirely different kind of battle was being waged. Zainab glided through the cavernous rooms, her serene smile a mask of iron control. She watched her husband, who had become even more tense and secretive, constantly on his phone, taking hushed calls in his study. He thought she was oblivious. He was wrong. Her barrenness had always been a strategic liability. Now, with Adekunle's strange behavior and his father's mounting pressure, she felt her position eroding. She was a queen on a precarious throne, and she would not be unseated. She needed information. She needed eyes on the inside of whatever game her husband was playing. One afternoon, she sat in her drawing room performing her ritual. She selected a fragile, antique porcelain teacup, its surface painted with delicate cherry blossoms. She brewed a rare single-estate white tea, its steam rising in a fragrant cloud. As she sipped, she made a decision. She knew just the person. Sister Kemi was a senior nurse at the most exclusive private clinic in the city, a place Zainab's family had patronized for generations. She was discreet, professional, and deeply indebted to the Bello family for a past favor. A week later, Adekunle came home to find his wife waiting for him, her expression one of perfect wifely concern. "Darling, I've been so worried about you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "All this stress. I took the liberty of arranging some private care for your health." He was about to refuse, but Zainab continued, "It's a nurse. Highly recommended. She can monitor your blood pressure, ensure you're eating well. Think of her as a personal assistant for your well-being." She smiled. "Father would be so pleased to know I am taking such good care of you." He was trapped. To refuse would raise suspicion with his father. He reluctantly agreed. The next day, his wife personally introduced him to Sister Kemi. She was a sturdy, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with watchful eyes and an air of unimpeachable competence. Adekunle barely gave her a second glance. His mistake. Zainab's real instructions to Kemi were simple and delivered in a hushed phone call. "He has a secret. He has hidden something or someone. Find it." It took the nurse 4 days. By monitoring Adekunle's car and his private financial transfers, she found the glass tower. She staked it out and saw the deliveries, the security. She reported back to her employer. Zainab's next move was a masterpiece of strategy. She went to her husband, her face a mask of concern. "Darling, a thought occurred to me. With your new project, you must be working with someone very important, someone who requires absolute privacy." She let the idea hang in the air. "Perhaps they have a delicate health condition? My nurse is the best. You should send her. It would be a sign of respect, a gesture of how seriously the Bello family takes this partnership." Adekunle was stunned by the suggestion. It was perfect. A nurse would ensure the girl and his investment remained healthy, and using his wife's own aid would allay any suspicion she might have. He agreed immediately, feeling a surge of relief, believing he had outsmarted her. The next morning, Imani answered a sharp knock on her apartment door. A sturdy woman in a crisp white uniform stood there, her hands clasped in front of her. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice polite but firm. "I am Sister Kemi. Chief Bello has sent me to look after you." A chill went through Imani. She looked into the woman's eyes and saw no warmth, no compassion. She saw a warden, a spy. The walls of her gilded cage, which she had just started to push against, had suddenly snapped shut, tighter than ever before. Days turned into a week under Sister Kemi's watchful eye. The nurse was professional, monitoring Imani's diet and health with chilling efficiency. The secret deliveries of suya stopped. The late-night sketching sessions became impossible. The young woman felt a new kind of isolation, the pressure of constant surveillance. One afternoon, while Imani was taking a mandated nap, the nurse did a thorough, quiet search of the apartment. She was looking for anything out of place, any clue to the girl's identity. She checked drawers, closets, under the bed. Finding nothing, she moved to the small nightstand in the walk-in closet. On a whim, she pulled the bottom drawer all the way out. She turned it over and froze. The back of the drawer was covered in breathtakingly complex architectural sketches, drawn with the dark smudged lines of a burnt match. There were buildings that twisted toward the sky, public spaces designed with an impossible grace, notes on structural load and material stress scrawled in the margins. It was the work of a brilliant, trained mind. Sister Kemi stared at the drawings, a sudden chilling realization dawning on her. The girl in the other room wasn't just some anonymous, powerless woman from the streets. She was someone. And whatever secret Adekunle Bello was hiding was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she or Zainab had ever imagined. The child was born, and in the quiet hum of the private hospital wing, Adekunle Bello's entire world fell apart. The months had passed in a blur of clinical precision. Sister Kemi's watchfulness never wavered, and Imani retreated deeper into herself, a silent, compliant vessel counting down the days. The delivery itself was smooth, efficient, and executed with the impersonal perfection that Adekunle's money could buy. He had booked out an entire floor of the city's most exclusive hospital, ensuring absolute privacy. He stood in the corner of the sterile delivery room, clad in scrubs that felt alien on his skin. He was impatient, his foot tapping a silent staccato rhythm on the polished floor. This was the final step, the culmination of his plan. Then a cry. sharp and strong. It cut through the tense air. "It's a boy, Chief," the doctor announced, his voice beaming. "A healthy, strong boy." A wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over Adekunle. He had done it. He had secured his legacy. A son. A Bello heir. He could already picture his father's face, the grudging respect that would replace the constant disappointment. He could see Jide's smug expression crumbling into dust. The nurses cleaned the baby, swaddled him in a soft blue blanket, and placed him in a clear, temperature-controlled bassinet. They were professional, their movements swift, their faces carefully neutral. After a few minutes of checks and hushed medical talk, the doctor gave a respectful nod. "We will give you a moment with your son, Chief." The door swished shut, leaving the new father alone in the quiet room. The only sounds were the soft hum of the medical equipment and the infant's gentle breathing. He walked over to the bassinet, his heart pounding a victorious drumbeat against his ribs. He looked down at the small, perfect face, the tiny, clenched fists. His son. A surge of pride, fierce and possessive, flooded him. This was his blood, his future. He reached in, his hands surprisingly steady, and lifted the swaddled infant. The baby was warm, a solid weight in his arms. He was real. This abstract solution to his problems was suddenly a living, breathing person. He adjusted the blanket, wanting to see his son's face more clearly. His fingers brushed against the baby's neck and stopped. There, just below the infant's ear, was a mark. It was not a blemish. It was a shape. Small, intricate, and perfectly formed. A star. Adekunle's breath hitched in his throat. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He stared at the mark, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible. It couldn't be. He knew that mark. He had seen it in the faded, sepia-toned photographs his mother kept in a locked rosewood box. A photograph of her as a young woman standing beside her own father, his arm draped proudly around her shoulders. And on her father's neck, clear even in the old photograph, was that same unique star-shaped birthmark. A dominant family trait, his mother had once called it. A mark of her lineage. The Bello family had no such mark. Their men were defined by a strong jawline, a certain set of the eyes, but nothing like this. This star did not belong to them. It was a sigil from another dynasty, another bloodline entirely. The baby in his arms was his. He knew that with sickening certainty. The timing, the circumstances, it was all his. Which could only mean one thing. The child's existence did not prove Amani's infidelity. It proved his mother's. The foundations of his world cracked. His name, his identity, his entire claim to the Bello legacy, all of it was built on a lie. He was not the pure-blooded heir he thought he was. He was the product of a secret, a man carrying the blood of a stranger. And this tiny, innocent child, created to cement his place in the dynasty, was the living, breathing evidence of his fraud. He swayed on his feet, the sterile white room suddenly tilting. He looked down at the baby, who stared back with wide, dark eyes. The child was not a symbol of his victory. He was a symbol of his ruin. The victorious pound of his heart had become a funeral drum. The door opened softly. It was Sister Kemi. She had a camera phone in her hand, held discreetly at her side. "Is everything all right, Chief?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. He could not speak. He could only stare at the star on his son's neck, the brand that had just seared away his past and incinerated his future. Sister Kemi's eyes followed his gaze. They flickered down to the baby's neck, and her expression did not change. But she saw it. He knew she saw it. Her thumb moved almost imperceptibly over the side of her phone. There was a soft, nearly silent click. A flash of light so quick it was almost imaginary. She had her proof. And Adekunle knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his secret was no longer his own. It was a weapon. And it was now in the hands of his wife. Panic was a cold, sharp thing in Adekunle's throat. He moved through the following days like a ghost, his actions driven by a primal, desperate need for confirmation. He paid Amani the final sum, a massive wire transfer that severed their contract. He arranged for the baby to be cared for by a team of private nurses in a separate wing of his mansion, a son he could barely bring himself to look at. The star-shaped mark burned behind his eyes. He needed to know for sure, but he couldn't test the baby. That would prove nothing. He needed to test himself. Under the guise of a routine executive health screening for the company, he arranged for a private lab to collect samples, one from himself, and one procured with a bribe to a nurse from his father. A single hair plucked from the old man's favorite armchair. The request was simple. The instructions discreetly passed to the lab technician along with a thick envelope of cash, a paternal DNA comparison. The results would be delivered by secure email. The wait was a special kind of hell. The CEO locked himself in his study, the same room where his father had delivered his ultimatum. He drank. The expensive whiskey did nothing to dull the sharp edges of his terror. He stared at the portraits on the wall, the long line of so-called ancestors, and saw only strangers. Was his entire life a performance? A lie he never even knew he was telling? His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Zainab. "Darling, are you avoiding me?" He ignored it. He couldn't face her. Not yet. Not until he knew the truth. In another part of the city, his wife sat in her immaculate drawing room, the afternoon light filtering through the silk curtains. She was not panicking. She was plotting. The photo from Sister Kemi had arrived on her phone an hour after the baby's birth. A high-resolution image, the star-shaped mark perfectly in focus. Zainab did not need a DNA test. She was a student of high society's dirty laundry. The mark triggered a memory, faint at first, then sharpening into focus. It was from a wedding, years ago. Two old society matriarchs, their tongues loosened by champagne, whispering behind their fans. "A terrible shame about the boating accident," one had said. "Tragic," the other had replied, her eyes glinting. Especially for the Bello family. Adekunle's mother was so distraught, almost as distraught as the young wife of that poor Folarin boy. Folarin, the name echoed in Zainab's mind. A once prominent family, known for their shipping business and a famous hereditary birthmark. A star. She made a single, discreet phone call. Her great-aunt, a woman whose memory for scandal was as sharp as her tongue, was only too happy to fill in the gaps. The story was an old one, buried by time and money. A passionate affair. A secret pregnancy. A conveniently arranged marriage to the up-and-coming, ambitious, and utterly oblivious young man who would become Old Man Bello. The CEO's wife hung up the phone, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. It was better than she could have ever imagined. Adekunle wasn't just hiding a surrogate. He was the secret. His entire claim to the Bello empire was fraudulent. She looked at the photo on her phone again. This small, pixelated image was not just leverage. It was a key to the entire kingdom. And she was the only one who knew how to use the lock. She made another call, this one to her lawyer. Her voice was calm, her instructions precise. The days crawled by for Adekunle. He paced his study, the whiskey bottle now half empty. He caught his reflection in the dark screen of his computer and saw a stranger looking back, a man with haunted eyes. He avoided his father, ignored Jide's probing calls, and lived in a self-imposed prison of dread. Then it came. An email notification pinged softly on his laptop. The subject line was a single sterile word, results. His hand trembled as he moved the cursor. He clicked. The file opened. It was a simple PDF, a lab report filled with genetic markers and technical jargon he didn't understand. He scrolled down, his eyes searching for the conclusion, the one part of the document that was written in plain language. He found it at the bottom of the page, a single stark sentence beneath a table of percentages. His world narrowed to those few black and white words. Based on the analysis of the genetic markers, the probability of paternity is 0%. 0. The word was not a number. It was an abyss, an obliteration. He was not a Bello. A sound, half-sob, half-strangled roar tore from his throat. He swiped his arm across the mahogany desk, sending papers, a lamp, and the half-empty whiskey bottle flying. The bottle shattered against the far wall, a splash of amber liquid staining the expensive wallpaper like blood. He sank into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a vast hollow emptiness. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed billion-naira deals, the hands that were supposed to steer the Bello empire into the next generation. They were the hands of a stranger, an imposter. His phone buzzed again. It was Zainab. This time he answered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Hello?" "Adekunle," she said. Her tone was not questioning, not angry. It was calm. Final. "We need to talk. My lawyer is drawing up some papers. I suggest you come home." She hung up. He knew with the chilling certainty of a condemned man that she knew everything. The game was over. He had lost. He just didn't know yet what the price of that loss would be. The Bello conglomerate boardroom was a theater of war disguised as a business meeting. The long polished table reflected the tense faces of the board members. At the far end, Jide was holding court, his voice smooth and confident as he laid out a new vision for the company, a vision that conspicuously did not include its current CEO. Adekunle sat silently at the head of the table, a ghost in his own kingdom, his authority stripped away by a secret he couldn't see. Jide was making his final move, proposing a vote of no confidence. The murmurs around the table were sympathetic. The king was faltering. It was time for a new one. Just as he called for the vote, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Zainab entered. She was not dressed for a fight. She wore an elegant ivory caftan, gliding into the room with the serene calm of a goddess. All eyes turned to her. "Forgive my interruption, gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the room. "My husband and I have an announcement." She walked to Adekunle's side and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of support. It was a gesture of ownership. The man stood, his movements stiff, his face a pale mask. He looked at the expectant faces of the board, at his cousin's predatory smile, and then at his wife. He had met with her just minutes before in a small, soundproof anteroom. There had been no shouting, no tears, only the cold, brutal precision of her terms. She had laid a single photograph on the table between them, the picture of his son, the star-shaped birthmark, a tiny, damning accusation. "This boy will be raised a bellow," she had said, her voice a whisper of ice. "We will announce a miraculous private adoption, a blessing. Your father will be ecstatic. The board will be reassured. The line will continue." He had stared at her, a flicker of hope igniting in the ashes of his despair. "But," she continued, pushing a document across the table, "you will not lead it." The document was his resignation as CEO. Her terms were not financial. They were far crueler. He would publicly endorse Jide to take his place, citing a sudden, overwhelming desire to step back and focus on his new family. He would keep his name, his shares, his wealth. He would keep his son, but he would lose his power completely. "Your punishment will not be poverty, Adekunle," she had finished, her eyes boring into his. "It will be a long, quiet, comfortable life of total humiliation. You will watch another man run your father's company. You will live every day as a ghost. Sign it." Now, standing before the board, he cleared his throat. The words felt like swallowing glass. "My wife is right. We have been blessed." He announced the adoption of their new son, a story of hope and miracles that he delivered with the dead-eyed cadence of a man reading his own eulogy. Then came the final blow. "And in light of this wonderful new chapter," he said, forcing the words out, "I've decided to step down as CEO. I want to focus on my family. I believe the company needs a leader with singular focus. I believe that leader is Jide." A stunned silence fell over the room. His cousin's jaw dropped, his triumphant expression replaced by sheer, dumbfounded shock. Zainab's serene smile never wavered. She had not just won, she had orchestrated a checkmate so perfect that her opponent had been forced to crown his own usurper. The vote was a formality. The war was over. The story does not end there. It ends in a series of quiet, disconnected moments months later. Jide, now CEO, sits in Adekunle's old office, but the chair feels too big, the power hollow. He is constantly looking over his shoulder, unnerved by Zainab's silent presence at board meetings, her quiet influence a web he can feel but cannot see. Imani sits in a new, modest apartment. The air smells of fresh paint and possibility. Sunlight streams through the window, illuminating the open pages of a thick architectural textbook she just bought. She traces the title with her finger, a slow, deliberate movement. She takes a deep, steadying breath. Her future is a blank page, an unbuilt structure. And for the first time in years, she holds the blueprints. The final scene is in a lavish, manicured garden. Adekunle is pushing his son on a swing. The boy, now a toddler with a head of dark curls, giggles with delight, his small feet kicking the air. A sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. He smiles back at him. It is a genuine smile, one that reaches his eyes. In losing everything he thought he wanted, he found the one thing he didn't know he needed. He is no longer Chief Bello, the embattled CEO. He is just a father pushing his son on a swing. But as the boy swings higher, the sun catches the side of his neck. For a fleeting second, the faint star-shaped mark is visible, a tiny, permanent reminder of the secret that blew his world apart and the lie that paradoxically set him free. The swing continues its gentle arc back and forth, a quiet rhythm in a life sentence that has, impossibly, started to feel like peace.